SEP Fanfic Readings presents Measure of a Man by Inna Days 22. Chapter 3. Leave Out All the Rest. March 21st, 2011. The 3 keys to gardening, Hermione had learned when she and Neville began expanding hers beyond tomatoes, beans, and courgettes, were good planning, forethought, and strategizing, which made it the ideal hobby for someone like Hermione. At first, it had been a hobby that was critical to her physical and psychological health after quitting the ministry. A sign from her therapist, who annoyed her immensely, it was an outlet for frustration with the eggshells everyone walked on around her. But after her fair share of failures, a breakthrough in therapy, and dedicating time to discover things about herself, Hermione began to understand that gardening was more than digging holes, sticking plants in the ground, and keeping them watered properly. It was about making connections. Ones with science, art, and biology. She was fascinated with making things thrive and harmoniously arranging plants in their surroundings. Experimentation was another key to gardening Hermione had yet to master, having learned everything she knew thus far from Neville, books, and experience, but that had to do with her own issues. By its very nature, experimentation involved a lot of testing and frequent failures. She'd done a lot of that in her life. She wasn't interested in doing more right now. She wanted to maintain the status quo, plant what she needed that would grow, and use her hard work to help others. She wanted to perfect the process before trying anything new. In order to do that, Hermione was back to doing 2 things that were at the core of who she was: research and learning. But now she was doing it for her own desire to better herself and the world in a capacity that actually made a difference. And it didn't nearly kill her in the process. So instead of laws, both magical and creature, she studied climate and weather patterns in her area and the purpose of indoor sowing. Before long, she was growing her own herbs for potions. Instead of being dragged into the machinations of the most powerful at the ministry who only wanted to use her image to make themselves look better, Hermione studied and tested soil for the right pH balance and mastered the art of fertilizing the earth correctly for each plant. Instead of politics and learning which members of the Wizengamot to avoid or approach, she familiarized herself with the correct wards to deter the wrong sort of wildlife. She built a greenhouse and figured out the magic needed to make it hold everything she needed. And instead of doing the work of 6 people, Hermione did the job of 1, combining all of her knowledge to use, cultivate, and till the earth to make way for new growth. It was exhilarating, never dull, always therapeutic. A practical hobby for a practical person. Gardening taught her that growth, including that of her mind, body, and ideas, started with a seed. What she did with it was up to her. Losing plants taught the value in all life, human or otherwise, and made her understand the importance of every step involved in nourishing something until it grew healthy and strong. Like herbs for potions, fruits, and vegetables, life needed care and fertilizer, time and patience, sunshine and water to grow. But gardening had also taught her to watch out for weeds. They were hard to define, much like people. Some were harmless, blending into their environment and living alongside the tended plants. In rare cases, they could even be considered beneficial, but others were destructive, and she made certain she pulled them as soon as she spotted them. If she didn't, they could spread and grow stronger, smothering the life out of the other plant's seedlings. Weeds impoverished the soil by depleting anything and everything just to strengthen themselves. One such weed was waiting for her in her home office in the form of Tiberius McLaggen, and Hermione couldn't wait for someone to pull him out by the roots. Following the end of the war, the quiet depowering of the position of minister through old laws had created a power vacuum unlike anything the wizarding world had ever seen. Chaos was the reason it went unnoticed. They were all too busy recovering and burying the dead, while every high-ranking ministry official who hadn't been associated with Voldemort rushed in to fill the void. One of those open positions had been Chief Warlock, who was the head of the Wizengamot. The wizard who had filled in was standing in her office, eyeing her table of that month's sows of sweet peas, cauliflower, and peppers that were almost ready to be planted outdoors. His presence wouldn't have been an issue had the changing of the structure of their government not made him the most powerful wizard in the country, because he was as crooked as they came. After receiving Theo's letters of refusal, he usually sent Cormac, and that was always an illuminating experience, especially when he kept his hands and thoughts about her figure to himself. Still, Cormac was easy to handle. But Tiberius... Outside of his penchant for bribing to get his way, she didn't know enough about him to decide one way or another. "Chief Warlock," Hermione greeted from her spot at the door, not moving. He was in his late 50s, but looked younger and stronger than ever. Like Cormac, he was tall, broad, and imposing. His brown hair was just as curly as his nephew's, but his eyes were as different as his overall presence. Cormac leered and flirted, but Tiberius was sharper, his attention laser-focused on her. There was a purpose and a reason for seeking her out himself. He seemed like the sort who had a reason behind everything, including his attire. Tiberius arrogantly donned official robes that signified his station, and when he turned, there was a pleasant expression on his face that was as fake as a copper galleon. "Ah, Miss Granger." He clasped his hands together. "I was wondering when you would turn up." Her plan had been to not turn up until after he had left back out the flue he had entered from, but after 30 minutes of waiting in the vegetable patch, Tiberius showed an aggravating level of persistence, like his nephew. "Your office is quite lively." It was spacious enough and mostly tidy, cozy, but about as professional as she could stand. Untouched by Pansy, who was chomping at the bit to decorate it, the office was a mishmash of rococo furnishings that blended in with her white walls, and the oak floors that flowed through every room of the house except the kitchen. On the white table in front of the windows, to the left of her desk, next to her vegetables, that were ready to go into the ground, were individual pots with that week's troublemakers, Dittany and Molly, who refused to sprout and needed more attention. "Thank you." She inclined her head slightly. "My personal office hours don't begin for another hour." "My apologies. I was unaware that I needed an appointment." "Yes, well, regardless of your position, I have a schedule to keep and a meeting in an hour, so please be brief." She crossed the room to her cluttered desk, taking her seat and gesturing to the one across from her. "Are you here for a consultation? I'm not accepting new patients at the moment, but I can always direct you to one of my peers. That is, if I know what sort of care you need." He declined the seat, further indication that he was there for a specific purpose. "I'm not here for a consultation. This is merely a friendly visit." Hermione wasn't sure if his smile was meant to be friendly, menacing, or a little of both. "I wasn't aware that we were friends." Tiberius' smile turned cold, definitely intended to be menacing. "My nephew has been singing your praises since Hogwarts. He continues to do so after meeting with you regarding your ongoing rejections of the Ministry's offers." Keeping the distaste off her face was a struggle. "Ah, well, I see. But that doesn't make us friends. Perhaps acquaintances at best." "Regardless, he firmly believes you will change your mind." "Then it is clear he doesn't know me at all." For a moment, they watched each other like opponents at chess, each trying to figure out the other's moves. Hermione was drawing all sorts of blanks. War hero status aside, she was a small cog in a large machine. His presence broke all kinds of established rules, as did her apathy about it. "A bit of advice, Miss Granger. When the Chief Warlock takes time out of his extremely busy schedule to pay you a visit, you should at least pretend to look happy about it." "I'll remember that." She opened her folder on her desk in preparation for her next meeting and folded her hands on top of it, leaning in slightly. "You want deference? But call this a friendly visit. I'll confess I'm perplexed. What is it that you want, Chief Warlock?" At first, Tiberius said nothing, moving from the vegetables to the eucalyptus plant she kept as an insect repellent. "Before I knew of your dedication during your time with the Ministry, I thought Cormac was exaggerating his tales of your intelligence, but now I know he was telling the truth. You're smart enough to gauge my reason for coming here." "I can, but I don't like to make assumptions." "The past work you did for the Ministry before your unfortunate departure was most impressive. So much that I wanted to personally see if you had carried that success on your next position." He gestured to the office around him. "It seems that you have." Hermione clenched her jaw. "You've been watching me." "Watching is such a harsh term with a negative connotation." His evasive response reminded her so much of his nephew, for all the wrong reasons. "I prefer to think of it as following your illustrious career." That gave her, well, not an idea, but something that needed confirmation. "Ah, so you're behind the job offers from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, not Hestia." She knew the answer. Hestia always rolled her eyes whenever they discussed the ridiculous offers. "If I am?" His eyes lingered on the troublemaker plant in her windowsill for a moment before they met hers. "The department under Hestia Jones is having an image crisis that even promoting the famous Harry Potter to the head of Aurors has been unable to cure." That was what happened when a dirty wound was left unattended. It festered until it didn't matter how much was done to fix it. The entire limb had to go. "It seems that the public's trust in those who uphold law and order is failing." Tiberius glanced out the window before returning his focus to her. "It's a problem that Harry doesn't seem to care about." Hermione moved her finger, using wandless magic to lift the kettle, spelled to keep warm. Another flick of her wrist, and it poured the steaming liquid into her empty teacup. Tiberius watched as if she was supposed to have a different reaction, one that didn't have her at ease enough to drink tea in the presence of the most powerful wizard in the country. After taking her first sip, she placed her teacup on the saucer and addressed the now glaring wizard without interest. "One could argue Harry has more than the public's trust to worry about. I can think of a few things, Death Eaters being one that you all seem keen on sweeping under the proverbial rug. An Auror is missing, several others were injured just days ago, and yet there was no mention of it in the papers." "We felt that there was no need to alarm the public." "So you're controlling the news outlets?" Hermione leaned back in her chair. "This feels familiar." Tiberius bristled. "That's not an accurate statement, Miss Granger. We've merely requested they run the story next week so that it doesn't interfere with the investigation." "What investigation? From what I hear, you're not allowing them to send a team after Mathers." Tiberius placed his hands behind his back, a comfortable and superior position. He wasn't threatened by her either. It appeared that he felt the need to show it. "Interesting. You're very informed for someone who left the ministry and has no inclination to return." "I am." It was a bold statement, but so was her next. "And I don't." "Shame," he tisked. "Harry Potter could use you at his side. Draco Malfoy could too." Keeping her recoil internal, she took another sip of tea. Why put them into positions of power if you don't believe they can do the job without someone else on their team? Their talent wasn't the reason they were placed in their current positions. That much Hermione already knew, but she was patiently listening, watching the Chief Warlock explain himself with bold gestures. "Harry Potter is the boy who lived, defender of all that is good and just. Draco Malfoy is redemption in the form of a man who turned on those his family used to align themselves with, rivals and enemies to allies. Their partnership is poetic." What utter tripe. "Apologies for my brusqueness. This isn't a theatrical performance, Chief Warlock. This is real life, with far-reaching consequences for your actions, or lack thereof. They may be qualified for the positions, but we each have a role we must play to ensure the preservation of our government and our way of life." Preserve was an interesting way to phrase that, when there was still so much that needed to be changed, so much that was still so wrong, so much that was corrupted, tainted by their mishandling. "All of us must do our part, including you, Miss Granger. People respect you. They remember your efforts in the war. The ministry would benefit, or, rather than use me as a draw to complete your trifecta to tote around as proof of your dedication to the fight against Death Eaters, you could actually do your jobs and provide the funding the Aurors office and task force need to clean up the mess created by the Wizengamot's ignorance. They're underfunded, not nearly trained enough, and spread thin. And yet, you're constantly giving them more responsibilities." "The ministry has many duties. We merely requested the Auror Department and the task force to perform theirs so that we can dedicate our efforts to restoring our economy, and—" "I'm aware of your duties to the economy." Hermione folded her arms. "But tell me something. Where do the people rank on that list?" "People benefit from economic growth and stability." "I'm talking about right now. What are you doing to help those who need it most at this very moment? Because it takes time for that to trickle down. Meanwhile, the rich get richer and people become more disenchanted." Hermione's stare sharpened like a blade. "How's business in Diagon Alley?" He would know. He owned every business and building, after all. Except the joke shop. And the fact that the Chief Warlock was allowed to manage his business and real estate while passing laws he directly benefited from was unconscionable. Unfortunately, due to a lack of precedent, There were no applicable wizarding laws. So while it wasn't illegal, the blatant disregard of any sort of ethics was appalling. It exposed a massive hole in the way things were run, a hole the Wizengamot had no interest in filling, and people noticed. "Business is not what I am here to discuss with you today, Miss Granger. My nephew hasn't been successful in having a conversation with you that would persuade you to change your mind regarding our repeated offers, so I thought I would come here to figure out what it is that you want. I'm willing to negotiate terms, salary, and further compensation upon measurable success." He paused. "Things that no one else needs to know." Now that he was showing exactly who he was, devoid of the public mask, Hermione shed hers. More like ripped it off. "I don't want anything you can provide me. I assure you, your problems are larger than me and my so-called influence, and I am not interested in being the Ministry's puppet again." Tiberius said nothing for a long moment. "I suppose you are part of the group that wants to unseat the Wizengamot." Hermione kept her face perfectly blank. He was not correct, as she had no direct dealings with them, but he wasn't wrong either. "We know they exist," he said in response to her silence. "They support you, too. That is, should you return." Ah, well, that explained it. They wanted her under their thumb. "I have no intentions to return. Not for you, not for anyone. Perhaps you should focus less on bribing me, less on trying to scheme in order to quiet the complaints, and more on doing your job. Protect the people. Help them. Give the Aurors and Task Force a fighting chance with the funding and time they need to— There are over 100 Aurors. I am aware." She gave him a dark look that he returned with a challenge. "I used to track that sort of thing when I worked for the Ministry in one of the many official jobs. They are trying to keep up with regular crime committed by desperate people who haven't recovered from the war that took place 13 years ago, while also fighting off Death Eaters in the countryside that are hiding in plain sight, and picking them off one group at a time. Not to mention working to find their base of operation. There aren't enough people to do what you're asking of them. The Ministry— I won't discuss the rising increase in popularity of the Death Eaters' cause." Hermione was in no mood for excuses. "And while they agree Voldemort was a megalomaniac with a philosophy that was severely flawed, the general consensus is that a regime change is a far better option than what they have right now." The expression on the Chief Warlock's face shifted to something tight, his anger barely restrained. Tiberius clearly wasn't going to be spoken to in the manner in which Hermione was speaking to him, used to respect. Well, respect was earned. "I think you have forgotten who I am." "I assure you I know exactly who you are. Your robes show the power you're happily wielding, no matter how unqualified. Nevertheless, I don't work for the Ministry. We make rules that affect you." "True, and not in all the good ways." His jaw worked as he continued to keep his temper in check. "And your department is funded by the Ministry." "Correction. Was. The startup was used for reasons you already know, but now we're self-funded through our research grants in a hospital that's privately owned. Not only do you have no power over my job, you also don't have any power in my home." Hermione allowed her words to hang in the air as she comfortably took another sip of her tea. Peppermint with no sugar or honey. But instead of lashing out, Tiberius did something odd. He smiled and looked genuinely pleased, positively electrified, engaged and intrigued by her. He actually looked a bit mad. "You have so much fire in you, Miss Granger. So much passion and brilliance. You're just what we need. You should consider returning and putting your skills to good use." "As I have stated many times over, I have no interest in returning to the Ministry. I'm not playing anyone's game." "Is this about the Ministry's handling of your incident?" The casual way in which she spoke of something so deeply personal made her flinch, visibly. It set her on edge. "Yes, most definitely, but also no." It was the best answer she could think of. "Oh?" Tiberius looked intrigued. "I'm aware of my own failings in that regard. I didn't prioritize myself and put my trust in an institution that did not care if I lived or died. An institution that just wanted me to get my work done and continued spouting praises for the Ministry until I was blue in the face. Quite literally." Unfortunately, she wasn't exaggerating. At the height of Hermione's rise in the ministry, when she was working extremely long hours and not tending to herself, she remembered feeling a wave of lightheadedness, then nothing else. She had no memory of it, but someone found her convulsing on the floor and rushed her to St. Mungo's. A week later, she woke up with no memories or knowledge of just how close to death she had worked herself. All she could recall were the worried faces of her friends, and later her parents, who struggled with the fact that she'd lost memories of an entire week to seizures she still couldn't remember. Seizures that had left her magic errant for weeks. Her body was weak for longer, her mind distressed and unable to string together complicated thoughts. Seizures that still threatened to return if she didn't monitor her stress. They wanted her back in the office 2 days after she had woken up. That request had sparked her decision to leave. Her health had been a gamble they were willing to take for their self-proclaimed greater good, and that left a sour taste in her mouth. Tiberius approached the topic like the politician he was, carefully. I will admit that the handling could have been better. However, we have nothing left to discuss. Please consider this my refusal of all offers extended. I have matters to attend to before my office hours begin. Please see yourself out. She was halfway out the door when she heard him again. You should reconsider, Miss Granger. I know how much you enjoy making a difference. You could help thousands. I'd rather do it my own way, thank you. The allure was simply not enough. With that, she left. March 22nd, 2011. Exactly 1 day after confirming her consultation with Theo's mystery patient, Hermione was sitting in her home office, reading through their file for the 3rd time, when Narcissa Malfoy stepped out of the Floo. Interesting. She wasn't the last person Hermione expected to see, but she was very close. That position belonged to her son. If it meant anything, she looked equally as surprised to see Hermione. The nonverbal clue told her that Theo was far sneakier than she had realized. He hadn't told either of them the complete story, and before she could speculate or speak to the witch who tried, but ultimately failed to suppress her shock, the Floo burst to life again as 2 security wizards stepped out. They took their place on either side of their charge, folding their arms in an attempt to look intimidating with their matching black robes and deep frowns. Like Hermione was a threat. She almost laughed. Narcissa stood out from her guards in lavender robes with silver accents, but Hermione spotted the mismatched gold band on a plain necklace. Her makeup, which highlighted her best features, was as perfect as her coiffed blonde hair. She was dressed to impress, and Hermione wondered if she might have dressed differently had she known the identity of the healer she was scheduled to meet. When she was younger, she knew the answer, but now it wasn't so clear. Hermione gestured to the chair in front of her desk. Please do take a seat. Addressing Narcissa's security wizard, she said, You both are welcome to wait outside the door. Narcissa sat in the offered chair with her hands properly placed in her lap and her back straight. Her guards remained rooted to their spots. Hermione stared at each of them, but they simply returned her pointed glare. The moment she was about to open her mouth and tell them to leave again, Narcissa raised one finger and motioned towards the door. The last one shut the door, and they were alone. Hermione allowed her eyes to slide from left to right before settling back on the witch sitting in front of her. It was the part of the conversation where she would usually ask the patient to tell her a little about themselves and what they sought to accomplish under her care, but today she merely waited. There was no need for formalities. They knew each other, even if it was barely well enough to identify the other on the street, or inside her home during a war. Today, Hermione decided to sit, wait, and watch as Narcissa's eyes scanned everything in her periphery, because the witch was too proper to turn her head or nose up. It didn't matter. Hermione knew what she was seeing. They were in her home, after all. On the walls, surrounding her white bookshelves that were spilling over with books, hung her accolades, her certificates, and the awards she'd won. Narcissa stared at each frame as closely as she could from where she sat, scanning each with sharp eyes, as if she found it impossible that someone as young as Hermione had managed to accomplish so much. But she was 31, with an Order of Merlin hanging in the center of her wall of achievements. When Narcissa saw it, she stopped trying to scrutinize. She started to take her seriously. It did nothing to help convince Hermione to accept her as a patient. It was business, she would explain to Narcissa at the end of the appointment, nothing personal. Theodore did not inform me that you were the healer he had arranged for this consultation. I surmised as much. Hermione glanced down at the file in front of her. When you requested the best. She raised her eyes to meet Narcissa's sharp gaze. You should have been more specific if a certain blood status was a prerequisite for your treating healer. My request was accurate. The older witch delicately patted her hairline with a silk-embroidered handkerchief. Hermione noted the sweat before she dabbed it away. Just seeing one symptom was enough to inform her that the potions she had been prescribed were not working. Pity. Narcissa seemed aware of her observation, and brought her hand back down as she narrowed her eyes defensively. You could be a troll as far as I am concerned, Miss Granger. However, if you are indeed the best, then I am in the correct office. Very well. Hermione said nothing further on the subject. Silence wasn't entirely uncommon during consultations. Some patients struggled to accept that they needed her help, but the ones that fell between them were different. Heavier. It coiled around Hermione, reaching into her stomach to settle there in a hard knot of history. There was so much of it, and it was complicated. Here was a witch who had been a prisoner in her own home when it had been converted into an unfathomable hell. A witch who had lied to Voldemort about Harry being dead, risking her life to protect her son. And here also was the witch whose sister who had taken joy in torturing her. Yet she was asking for Hermione's help. The irony was not lost on her. But years in therapy had taught her that healing from trauma wasn't just physical or mental. It was also about taking charge of her personal liberation from the mental state of victimization by not allowing herself to let past trauma interfere with her present future. While looking at Narcissa, she reminded herself that she'd already forgiven the witch and her family. She had let it go years ago, and she refused to go back to that place once more. She hadn't forgiven them for their sake. No, it was for hers. Hermione knew that she couldn't grow if she held on to every grudge, couldn't fly if she allowed herself to stay grounded by every weight in her past. And she very much wanted to do both. Forgiveness wasn't an action, but a choice that she continued to make every day. It wasn't easy, but Hermione had accepted her decision not to allow hate to cloud her judgment anymore, and that granted her the peace of mind she needed to be objective about the witch in front of her. Detached enough to consider the facts of the assignment, and not the patient. The truth was that she couldn't accept her as a patient, no matter what the angle. Hermione had rules about accepting patients she knew in any capacity. She mentally glared rusty daggers at Theo because he had known that all along, and yet he had still suggested she keep an open mind. "Would you care for tea?" Hermione politely gestured to the kettle on her desk, charmed to stay warm. She provided this blend during all of her initial consultations. It's a blend of lemon balm, kava, and valerian root. It's good to calm the nerves. Narcissa looked mildly impressed, but ultimately declined. My nerves are perfectly calm, thank you. Hermione saw the subtle signs of stress, whether intentional or not. She saw the eye movements and tension in her shoulders that spoke to it, but she refused to make assumptions about a witch she hardly knew. 13 years had passed, and she doubted Narcissa Malfoy was the same witch that she had been. That was impossible. Losing her husband and way of life had changed her, made her retreat. She disappeared from both London society and the country itself, living in an undisclosed part of France until recently. And yet, she had been busy in her self-imposed exile. 2 years after her husband's death, Narcissa had published a tell-all that Hermione had never bothered with, but Andromeda had read it roughly 6 months after it had been released. It accurately detailed her life growing up in the Black household, with a very honest telling of Andromeda and Sirius' exits from the family, one that the witch herself couldn't denounce. She wrote of her marriage, her son, without many details as he wished for privacy, the events that led to Voldemort living in their home, and every bit of suffering that followed up until her betrayal the night of the Battle of Hogwarts. Andromeda had cried when she read Narcissa's words to Lucius about those final few moments when he'd hid her and their son away before the Death Eaters attacked. She cried harder when Narcissa detailed watching the manor burn from a distance with Draco at her side. She wrote about it all, the emotions she felt, the pain, the parallels between her fate and the manor's, destined to be both consumed and preserved by the never-ending magical fire. It had been hailed as a poignant and harsh, yet honest tale of a witch's journey through life on the wrong side of the war, the bestseller that had propelled her into stardom after a brutal war. Now that Narcissa was sitting in her office, Hermione wondered if she carried the same prejudices that had been instilled in her from birth, or if the war had taught her that there was a better way. Bigotry was hard to notice in oneself, and harder still to change, but it could be done. Maybe change had already taken root, but Hermione would never know because Narcissa was still a private and proud woman, but only proud of what she had created, overcome, and achieved. Exactly in that order. The rest, Hermione could tell, was too murky for her to tackle with the patience she didn't intend on acquiring. So she waited out the silence by sipping her own tea, green with a twist of fresh lemon from her greenhouse. A quick glance was all the other woman received before Hermione continued detailing notes for Roger Davies, whom she intended on passing Narcissa's case along to. He would enjoy the challenge. "I thought that you would ask more questions, Miss Granger." "What would you like me to ask?" Hermione rested her elbows on the arm of her chair, relaxing as she tapped her fingers together and looked the blonde witch straight in the eye. "I've read your file 3 times. Perhaps you might inquire about my current condition." "Honestly, I don't specialize in your condition, but from what I've observed, the elixirs and potions they have prescribed you are either not working, not the correct combination, or you aren't taking them consistently." Then she waved her hand and the kettle lifted off the table, pouring hot tea into the glass teacup in front of her. Narcissa hesitated for a moment before properly picking up the cup and taking a sip. After noting her approval, Hermione continued on. "I've noticed that you are currently experiencing symptoms, sweats mainly, but if I were to run diagnostic charms on you, I would likely find your pulse and blood pressure elevated. You've taken particular care of your makeup, likely because it covers the fact that you aren't sleeping well, and you experience daytime drowsiness. I've poured tea for you because you don't seem to trust yourself. Have you dropped anything recently due to tremors? Have you ended up in a place not remembering how you got there? Have you mixed up people's identities, even infrequently?" Hermione noticed the slight twitch in Narcissa's jaw that confirmed both her observations and answers. "That's the nature of your disease. I don't have any questions about what I already know." Narcissa sat the teacup on the saucer, looking stiff. "It seems that Draco did not exaggerate in any of his childhood accounts of your intelligence." "It is my job to be observant." Hermione suppressed her chuckle by taking a quick sip of tea before continuing her notes with the recommendations of care to Davies. Narcissa took a delicate sip of her tea. For a moment she was quiet. "I know what you must think of me for coming here for your help after what happened between you and my sister." Her tone was so matter-of-fact that it prompted Hermione's candid admission. "To be quite honest, until you came through my flu today, I barely thought about you. Well, unless your other sister mentioned you." It wasn't often, but she kept that piece to herself. And for good reason, judging by the stony look on Narcissa's face. Over the years, Andromeda had seemed keen on reconnecting with her younger sister, but it had yet to happen. She'd spoken of it, wrote letter after letter, but hadn't sent a single one. Hermione wondered if finding out about Narcissa's illness would change things, but it wasn't her place to deliver that information. "With that being said," Hermione continued, trying to steer them back into the realm of professional conversation befitting their current meeting, "I know you aren't here to discuss the past, and neither am I. I'd like to leave it behind us. This is your time to speak about your goals and motivation for seeking treatment. As I decline, my condition will require constant care." It sounded like Narcissa had accepted her disease, which was honestly better than most patients in her predicament. Hermione made a quick note to Davies. "I am aware, but why specifically me?" "You are the best, according to Theodore. I trust his judgment." Narcissa placed her half-empty teacup on the saucer and straightened her spine. "I cannot change my fate, but it appears that with the proper care, I will be able to buy myself time. When she folded one hand over the other on Hermione's desk, she seemed to strip away all the pretenses and pride, highlighting the reality of her condition and her reason for seeking such specialized care, at such a high price. Patiently, she waited until Narcissa finally spoke. "I am not finished preparing myself and my family. I would also prefer that my grandson not lose his mother and grandmother so close together. He's just a boy." An odd feeling came over her when she actually allowed herself to think about the fact that Draco Malfoy, of all people, had become a husband, a father, and a widower before the age of 30, and she was still, single, no prospects, no children of her own. Not that she was complaining or wanted a different circumstance, but it was a jarring comparison. She dusted away the thought like an annoying piece of lint and kept moving forward. And Draco, he is not ready to be alone. A complex maelstrom of emotions warred across Narcissa's features right then, one that seemed to threaten to pull her under. Hermione remained a good distance away, trying to recall where she'd put the box of tissues, and quietly summoning them from the table where her stubborn plants were fighting against nature itself. Hermione wanted to tell her that, while she'd spent her life protecting her son, no one could prevent the inevitable. But she kept her thoughts to herself, firmly locked away as she waited patiently for Narcissa to pull herself back together. I would like to see him settled and remarried before sooner rather than later. He complies with my request to take marriage meetings. Funny name for a date, she thought sarcastically. But I know he is stalling, biding his time. My son is an intelligent man, but he is more stubborn than practical. He likes to control the things he can, and he thinks he can control this by waiting. Hermione nodded along, half listening. She was still distracted by that bothersome piece of lingering mental lint. Of course, she had known that Malfoy's father had been killed. Everyone knew and had mixed feelings about whether or not Lucius Malfoy had redeemed himself in death. It was such a gray area that Hermione vowed never to broach the subject. It wasn't her place. Hermione also knew that Draco's marriage to Astoria Greengrass had been finalized the year his mother had published her book. Hermione had heard about the birth of his son, Scorpius, shortly before Al's birth in a roundabout way. The announcement had been splashed all over the society papers Hermione used as compost. Daphne had been part of her circle of friends before she eloped with Dean, and she talked of her nephew from time to time, but mainly with Ginny because Albus was his age. And when Astoria died last November, Daphne, who had been missing from their Friday gatherings during her younger sister's rapid decline, had turned up at Hermione's house at 3 a.m. the day of her funeral. She was in tears and didn't know what flowers to bring. Flowers just from her. Hermione had given her a pot of gladiolus from her greenhouse, told her to plant them by her graveside, and quietly spelled them to remain in a state of stasis. She'd never met Astoria, but from Daphne she knew of her strength and sincerity. The flowers seemed appropriate, but the act was done for a friend who was mourning, not for Draco Malfoy's deceased wife. And while Hermione knew all of this, she had never spared a moment to analyze what any of that meant as it pertained to Malfoy or his state of being, his job, his role as father and son, the threats against his family. Hermione never once thought about any of those events as something that had occurred in his life, incidents that could and would define him. But they had. You can't make him prepare, Hermione said in an attempt to firmly push the thoughts away before they could completely crystallize. It has to be a choice that he makes on his own, one that only he can make. Perhaps, Narcissa lifted her head, still looking grim, but I would like the time to try, for both of their futures. It is only proper that he marries to provide a mother for Scorpius, which is my goal while I am still alive. She looked as if she were trying to find something in Hermione's expression, and when she found whatever she was searching for, she rose to her feet, smoothing her robes with firm strokes. Her eyes widened slightly when Narcissa gave her a cold look. It appears that I will not find the extra time I need under your care. Hermione raised a single eyebrow in response. Just as you are observant, Miss Granger, I am as well. I haven't lost myself just yet. Hermione rested back on her chair and listened with a blank look on her face. I have seen enough healers in the last year to know that, had you wished to accept me as a patient, this consultation would have gone very differently. You would have done your own diagnostic charms and compared them to your prior readings. She wasn't wrong. You would have explained why your care has been described by many as exemplary, and by now we would be reviewing parchments with a more detailed layout of your treatment plans. There was no need to mince words. She'd never been good at it. You're correct. Hermione stood up as well and walked around her desk, approaching as the other witch watched her every move with sharp eyes. Narcissa certainly hadn't appreciated the rejection. No matter, Hermione didn't like the fact that she'd been put in the position in the first place. It was a moot point, but that didn't mean she would be rude. Now, standing in front of Narcissa, she couldn't help but make comparisons between them. While the older witch was well put together, even after the episode during their consultation, Hermione was not. Her hair was pulled back in a rushed bun, and she wore comfortable faded jeans, a long-sleeved gray shirt, and ankle-high wellies. Not professional, but she had been checking on the outdoor herbs before a night of rain when she remembered the appointment. There was still dirt on one of her knees, but she made no move to brush it away. Instead, she stood straight under Narcissa's scrutiny. "I'm referring you to Healer Davies. He's excellent, and will be willing to accept the terms of your contract." With a wave of her hand, the door opened and the guards immediately filed in. "He would be best to handle your specific needs." Narcissa bristled. "Might I have a reason as to why you're refusing to accept me?" She held up a hand in gesture for her to wait. "I have answered my own question. Of course, it has to do with our history on opposite sides of the war." "If that were the case, it would be my right to make that decision." She inclined her head slightly to one side. "Don't you agree?" A flash of something passed over the older witch's face, frustration or shame. She couldn't tell which, but she exhaled and didn't argue because she knew she couldn't. "I do." Hermione noted the reluctance in her voice, but knew that it came from a place of pride. Honesty wasn't easy for everyone. However, that simply isn't the truth. Hermione kept her tone direct but professional. "Regardless of the past, I don't work with patients that I know in any capacity due to the involved nature of the care that I provide. It's a rule of mine that is very well established, and I am perplexed as to why Theo referred you to me, knowing our history." "Theo has his own motivations." That was something they could agree on. What the motivation was, she wasn't certain, but it had to be large if he thought she would break her rules and treat Narcissa for him. Narcissa thought about asking if she knew Theo's endgame, but the older witch likely wouldn't tell her without a price. "I suppose he does. However, I don't need his approval to deny you," Hermione said bluntly, meeting Narcissa's gaze with one of her own. "I'll see to it that Roger gets your file and schedules an appointment with you as soon as possible. I wish you the best of luck." "I thank you, Miss Granger," Narcissa said thinly, "for nothing more than wasting my time." Hermione never learned to cook with magic. Even under Mrs. Weasley's tutelage, she had never been able to master the craft. Molly had said she lacked the drive, a phrase that had never before been used to describe Hermione Granger, but she might have had a point. The issue wasn't a lack of interest, but rather that it never felt natural. Maybe it was due to years of eating her mum's failures and triumphs, but Hermione found very little joy in food that was too perfect. Something about a meal coming out a bit oblong or a touch too dark, one that she had made with her own hands, was more appealing than one that was flawless thanks to the aid of magic. Ron thought it was a pity that she'd never learned, but he never mentioned it again when she suggested that he should be the one to join Harry in taking lessons from Molly if he wanted magically cooked meals. Ron's silence was likely due to his inability to answer the question as to why he didn't need to learn in a way that wouldn't get him hexed. When Hermione had moved into her house and started her vegetable patch, but before she'd started Healer Academy, she had been in a bookstore in Godric's Hollow, on the hunt for a book to help with her struggling wormwood plant. Neville had been busy, so she'd taken it upon herself to find the information she needed. During her search, Hermione had walked down the wrong aisle and came face to face with a row of Muggle cookbooks. Impulsively, she'd purchased one that had "Simple" in the title. It came with a free bookstand, and Hermione left happy with her decision. Until a month later, when she'd finally found a moment to attempt shepherd's pie. It had ended with Hermione using her wand to air out the smoke and char from her kitchen. She'd quickly learned the error of her ways and decided to start from scratch. Eggs and boiled potatoes. Then grew on that. Improved. Worked until she was ready to try recipes out of the book again. Cooking was a lot like potions. If she followed the recipes verbatim, she wouldn't have any issues. And while that wasn't always true, she still used her skills in brewing to get better. After a series of lackluster attempts while discovering the art of seasoning with herbs and spices, the first successful meal Hermione had made, that her friends genuinely enjoyed, was beef Wellington. She'd made it to celebrate finishing her first year of Healer Academy, and as they ate and raved, Hermione had felt a sense of accomplishment that waving her wand to cook couldn't replicate. After the conclusion of her appointment with Narcissa, Hermione, now far more proficient, didn't have the time needed to recreate her first success for dinner with her friends that evening, so she opted for something simple. Coq au vin, with roasted new potatoes and a salad made with homegrown spring greens. She just set the warming charms on her meal and started prepping the salad when Harry stepped out of the flue. Ginny had taken the kids to Shell Cottage that morning for the weekend so they could spend time with their older cousins, Louis and Dominique, who hadn't gone off to Hogwarts yet. Harry brought over a Pinot Noir and a bottle of Ogden's because they'd finished the last one the previous Friday, which had made Saturday rough. Al hadn't minded just laying in the conservatory after their walk towards the forest because even after a hangover potion, Hermione hadn't been able to do much else. "Hey, it smells great in here. Do you need any help?" Harry was always willing to help however he could, but Hermione sat down the knife she was using to chop the red peppers for the salad and shook her head. "I'm putting the last bit into the salad, so no." She grinned at her best friend, accepting both his embrace and the wine she put in the chiller. The Ogdens went under the island, stored with the rest of the liquors she'd collected over the years. We're just waiting for everyone else. "Who all's coming?" "Ron and Pansy." First Harry rolled his eyes, because the two constantly argued, and then he smirked. She knew he rather enjoyed the bickering. Hermione laughed. "She promised to behave." "I'll believe it when I see it." "Fair point," Hermione shrugged. "How was your day?" she asked carefully. It would be rude if she didn't, even though she already knew the answer. Harry had been promoted to head of the Auror department after the prior head had gotten so fed up with Draco Malfoy that he'd retired 8 years early just to avoid working with him. Harry had no illusions about the reason he'd been promoted. He was, after all, the boy who lived. Twice. And the Ministry used Harry the same way they had once tried to use her, as a symbol, a prop. He was a promotional tool they wielded to maintain the public's trust, without any power to make real change. But unlike her, Harry had accepted the role for his own reasons. He believed that the reason behind his promotion wouldn't negate the good he could accomplish. He was determined to eliminate the threat of the Death Eaters, not just for the wizarding world, but for his family as well. His new position had come with an office, a more generous salary, and the very large task of collaborating with the Terrorism Task Force and Draco Malfoy. The Wizengamot had put pressure on them both to make measurable progress as the public's disapproval with the Ministry as a whole continued to decline, especially after a Death Eater attack in December that had leveled an entire wizarding village as nothing more than a message to the Ministry. And yet, despite the heavy odds, underfunding, and general chaos, they'd had a few successes and captured a handful of high-ranking Death Eaters in the last 2 months. However, that wasn't enough to appease the Wizengamot. But Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither were their problems. Hermione found it appalling that they'd had the audacity to give him so little and demand so much, but she didn't work at the Ministry, so it wasn't her place to object. Mostly. Things had been tense. It didn't help that the two men at the center of all of it could barely stand each other. After years of therapy, Harry had learned better coping skills addressing his childhood trauma, and made peace with the long list of losses he'd endured along the way. He was calmer now that the piece of Voldemort had been killed off, able to focus. He smiled more and was harder to anger, especially after becoming a father. But he hadn't quite gotten past his old grudge. Not completely. There was something about Malfoy that woke up the 15-year-old inside Harry that had wanted very much to punch him in the face. Regularly. Repeatedly. Harry ranted about him often enough that Hermione would complete several mental tasks, make her list for the market, update her to-do list, and do a little aimless mind-wandering while Harry let it all out. It never failed that whatever she did, whenever she returned to him, he would still be complaining. Today was no exception. My day was normal in that Malfoy was being an utter bastard. Harry threw up his hands just as Hermione started the timer on her watch. She wanted to know if he would break his own rant record this time. "Remember that raid I told you about?" She nodded mechanically. Malfoy, after an exhaustive search, had located the Welsh hideout for the Lestrange brothers at the end of last year. Then he'd recruited a wizard to infiltrate their ranks. 2 weeks ago, that spy had reported back that there would be a meeting with the highest-ranking Death Eaters, but the date was not yet known, only that it would be before the end of May. From what Harry had disclosed, it seemed like they could end it all during this raid. Everyone had been discreetly preparing. Cursebreakers were slowly being pulled off assignments to examine evidence and dark objects found that would assist the prosecution. Hit wizards and magical law officers were being pulled in to grow their numbers, but they hadn't had the time or capacity for the training needed to make them a more unified front. Yeah, well, he dismissed every team lead I've suggested without any reason beyond thinking they're incompetent, but wouldn't suggest orders that he approved of because that's my job. Hermione kept her flinch inward, but only just barely. She could practically hear those words coming from Draco. Well, the 16-year-old version of him. She hadn't been in the same room as the adult version, and thus had no reference material unless she counted Harry's accounts. And, well, her best friend was a lot of things, but he wasn't always a reliable source when it came to Draco Malfoy. However, if she were to judge his character based on Harry's complaints and the bits that she had heard about him, Hermione would say he was still the same bastard he'd been during school, no matter how incredibly fit Pavarti had found him. Every plan I've designed around entry points into the manor he's rejected. He called them simple and that I'll get everyone killed, and that my freakishly good luck only extends to me. Privately, Hermione heard that one in Malfoy's teenaged voice, and wondered if it was too early to open the new bottle of Ogden's. For him. Oh, Harry snapped his fingers. And then I recommended Peruvian instant darkness powder, and Malfoy said no, because it's too messy. He wasn't wrong, but Hermione didn't say anything. Yet. I brought in a wards expert to remove the ward, but he found someone else, a pureblood, to do it. Harry, whose cheeks had gone red, balled his fists, one of these several anger management tips he'd learned over the years. It didn't look to be working because he was in full-on rant mode. I just hate it when we meet with the Wizengamot. I have to pretend like everything is just fine. Pretend that I'm not working with the biggest wanker I've ever known. And I have to act like a fucking professional when all I want to do is toss him out my window every single time I see his ferret face. Harry took 2 deep, cleansing breaths, a technique he'd picked up from Ginny's Lamaze classes. Then he smiled. That felt good. Better out than in. True, said Hermione, stopping her watch, hoping he didn't realize that she had been timing his Malfoy-centered rants. He hated when she did that. The record had been 6 minutes and 13 seconds, set the day of their first meeting as heads of their respective departments. They'd nearly come to blows. Today he hadn't even been close. 1 minute and 35 seconds. Hermione cleared her throat and hoped she wouldn't start another rant with her perspective on the matter. She'd hate to have to restart the clock. While I don't entirely disagree with Malfoy, at the betrayed look on her best friend's face, she raised both her hands. Hear me out, Harry. He's got a point about Peruvian instant darkness powder. It's a hindrance that will only cause more injuries through friendly fire. Besides, last I heard, the Hand of Glory was locked away in the Department of Ministries. I doubt anyone will approve its use, given its tendency to wind up in the wrong hands. At that, Harry pulled face, frowning deeply. I didn't think about it like that. He rolled his eyes. If he'd said it like that, I wouldn't have argued so hard about it. Malfoy probably would have, but Hermione let Harry think that while she sat the bowl with the mixed salad in the fridge to keep cool while they waited. The next person arrived not long after that. As soon as Hermione shut the door and turned around, ready to bring up Tiberius's visit, Pansy arrived with a small pop, wearing a long-sleeved turquoise bohemian play dress that had small flowers she couldn't identify from across the room. She did, however, recognize the positively thunderous look on Pansy's face. If Hermione were a betting person, she'd wager her entire Gringotts vault on the possibility that she was the source of Pansy's ire. If not for the glare in her icy blue eyes, then for the fact that she started yelling before Harry could greet her. I can't believe you rejected her as a patient! Hermione had never even considered herself an overly emotional person. There were moments when her heart went out over her brain, moments when she reacted too quickly. She was human, after all, and that meant she constantly found herself balancing between hundreds of extremes. But generally, she prided herself on using her brain and logic to sort through every situation as it manifested itself. And this was an issue. While maintaining detachment, Hermione approached the island where Harry sat in wide-eyed silence, while the witch to the right of him practically panted her indignation. Though there were several questions that crossed her mind. How? What? When? Who? She cast them aside to focus on Pansy before burning anger left scorch marks on everything. This is about Narcissa Malfoy. It was an overly calm, rhetorical statement designed to distract Pansy, and it worked. Her eyes went wide as she sputtered like a fish out of water. Her mouth opened and closed just as fast. Before she could get her second wind, Hermione rested one hand on the granite. I have theories about how you managed to find out so quickly, or why you're involved in this matter to begin with, but I won't deny that I rejected her as a patient. Why? And don't waste your breath spouting your healer rubbish about not being able to be objective because you know her. I wasn't born yesterday, Granger. I don't tell you how to do your job, so you don't get to tell me how to do mine. Harry cleared his throat. How about I just... Without taking her eyes off Pansy, Hermione raised her hand. Stop talking, Harry. Okay. Don't talk to him like that! Pansy cut her eyes at Harry, who looked just as surprised by her defense before she swore violently. What the... You've got me defending Potter, for fuck's sake! You owe me a drink when I stop being mad at you. Shite! That didn't even feel right! Harry frowned when he wanted to be offended, but then he shrugged. She had a point. Hermione, on the other hand, examined Pansy with a probing look the other witch had always hated. In fact, she probably would have hissed like a cat had they not had an audience. I'm surprised you're the one arguing on her behalf and not her actual son. Pansy rolled her eyes. Draco would sooner choke on his pride and die than ask for help from anyone. It's not his way. It never has been his way. Control issues galore. Their relationship is strained at best anyway, and he has enough problems on his hands. The threats, work, I'd say Scorpius too, but he's not involved in child-rearing. That's Narcissa's job now that Astoria's gone. Hermione recalled that bothersome thought one more time before firmly locking it away, and throwing away the key. Hermione tilted her head. Why do you care? I've known Narcissa my entire life. She's been more of a mother to me than my own. And that was before she burned me. Pansy looked away and then back touching her hair, seemingly uneasy with her own candidness, especially around Harry, who looked intrigued. As soon as she heard what happened, she gave me a chance to get away from it all until I was ready to stand on my own 2 feet. She spoke of Narcissa like Hermione spoke of Mrs. Weasley. It was a comparison she couldn't ignore. When she told me about her illness, and Theo said that he was going to ask you to take her case, I was relieved because I knew she would be in the best hands. I hoped she might live as long as possible. Scorpius, though, while I don't exactly agree with how rigid she is being with his schooling, needs the stability as long as possible. And I've seen how dedicated you are to your patients. I thought... Her voice went brittle. Well, obviously, I was wrong. Have you seen me with my patients? Because I don't believe you truly have. I essentially become a part of their lives. I monitor everything, from their meals to their family situations, and should anything negatively affect them, I rectify the situation. I grow the ingredients for their potions in my greenhouse, and what I can't find, I acquire, no matter how specific. Pansy tried to interject. It takes time and effort and a certain finesse that's not typical of any healer out there. The meals they eat are from my vegetable patch, made by my own hands. I'm not just their healer. I don't simply wave a wand, feed them potions, and make them better. I look out for their physical, mental, and emotional health. I help their families, because most people forget how much of a difference a supportive and knowledgeable family can make when it comes to a patient's care. Narcissa's, from what little I got from her today, is convoluted at best, not to mention the fact that I don't even specialize in her disease. Pansy folded her arms against her chest. I know that. All of that. Then you should understand why I won't take her. Don't judge what you don't understand. For a moment her blue eyes were unguarded and opened. She just wants time, Hermione. Roger will be... Davies? She glanced. That pompous brat. He'd sooner... It's not about Roger's personality. It's about his ability to do his job objectively. Narcissa and I have a history, Pansy, and it's complicated. That's like asking Harry to care for her. It's... I'd do it, Harry interrupted with a small, casual shrug. When they both turned their attention back to him, he ran a hand through his perpetually unruly hair. What? She caught sight of his famous scar before he brushed his hair back over it. We've been writing for years now. Not often, but a few times. Her letters come to Grimmauld Place. Pansy gaped at him. Hermione almost did as well. He didn't seem particularly bothered. I had tea with her there when she returned to the country. It was right before Malfoy took his position. Andromeda was supposed to meet us, but she declined at the last minute. Sometimes Harry caught her by surprise with the things he kept to himself. Pansy stared at him intensely. You'd help her? Yeah, he shrugged again, looking between the 2 witches. At one point, she helped all of us. His response was simple in its totality, and yet it said so much more. Hermione's favorite room in her house was the conservatory. It was a glass-paned addition located just off her kitchen, with pitched ceilings that gave her a room with a view of the beautiful land around her home. It reminded her that she was a part of the natural order. From any spot, she could see the world beyond her vegetable patch, the separate cobblestone walk that led from the steps to the fence, the field, and the trees in the distance that divided the end of her property and the start of the dense forest. But when simply looking wasn't enough, there was a door that opened up to the world. Pansy had spent the better part of the winter turning it into an oasis with creative lighting, floor-to-ceiling trellis in each corner for the climbing roses, decorative rugs that kept the stone floor warm, and a small jungle of plants and flowers elegantly arranged in different places in the room. The lounge area was in the center of the room, with a dark resin wicker sofa, settee, and 2 matching chairs, all with plush cream cushions. They artfully surrounded a glass-topped table lined with candles that were spelled to turn on whenever someone entered the room. To the right, just beyond the lounge area, was a reading nook tucked off with lamps, and a comfortable chaise large enough for 2 people. It wasn't uncommon for her to fall asleep in the chaise under a blanket while reading a book, or while gazing at the stars. To the left of the lounge was an eating area with creative lighting for when it got too dark. Hermione's original dining table, a circular glass table with 6 chairs she'd been sentimental to give up, served as the focal point of the area. It wasn't uncommon for Hermione to have dinner out here with their guests, or alone. Tonight the 4 of them sat comfortably, eating the meal Hermione had prepared, chatting under floating lamps that lined the stone outer wall of her home. The sun had dipped behind the trees as purple dusk began its mission to take over the sky and prepare it for nightfall. The stars would be making an appearance soon, too, and it was forecasted to be clear enough for them to enjoy the sight. While Ron and Harry talked and joked around like always, Hermione drifted in and out of their conversation. They grew more animated as dinner progressed, and their lips loosened over the lager Ron brought with him. Neither were keen on the wines she and Pansy drank. As usual, Ron sat a little too close enough for her to feel his thigh brush against hers every now and then, close enough for her to catch a small whiff of the scent she had often associated with him. Hermione knew what he was doing, the goal he was trying to accomplish. Ron wasn't nearly as subtle as he thought, especially when he rested his hand on the back of her chair while talking to Harry. He wanted her to let him back in, and he would keep trying bit by bit until she did. But Hermione was more than stubborn. She was uninterested, too. So, when his fingers absently brushed against her hair, she scooted away, silently shutting him out while Pansy looked at him in disapproval. Hermione found herself more focused on Pansy than Ron during the course of their meal and conversation. Pansy had let the earlier conversation lapse with Ron's arrival, but she was well aware the other witch was plotting. Pansy was more tolerable than expected. Tactfully amicable was a term that surfaced in Hermione's mind when she'd only looked mildly disgusted as Ron waved a chicken bone in the air while explaining something or other to Harry. Pansy would play nice and bide her time like a coiled snake, waiting for the perfect moment to strike her prey, and Hermione was no one's prey. The wards alerted Hermione to the arrival of an unexpected guest. She immediately looked at Ron on her right. "Percy's here." "Who is that?" Pansy nearly spit out her sip of wine. "Ron's brother." Hermione nudged Ron with her elbow as he tried to figure out why his brother was there. Then she wanted it to dawn on him. "Oh, right!" He jumped from his seat and headed towards the door, not paying attention. He nearly clipped the settee, but recovered. "He's bringing our tickets to the Cannons game tomorrow." "The tickets weren't free?" Pansy asked with a bemused look on her face. "As if I'd pay one knut to see them lose." At her comment, Ron looked both outraged and insulted. The 2 emotions waged war over the right to be expressed first, but ultimately he ended up sputtering like an engine that failed to start and vanished into her house after giving Pansy a deathly glare she simply laughed at. Harry and Hermione chuckled into their respective drinks and exchanged knowing looks. Pansy wasn't wrong, but neither one would even so much as hint at that to their friend. Hermione watched as the witch finished the rest of her wine and stood, pushing her chair in. "I have now reached my Weasley quota for one day," Hermione would have explained, but thought it better for her to find out on her own. Harry, however, tried to give her a clue. "Percy's different." "Does he have table manners?" It was a very serious question from someone like Pansy Parkinson. "In a manner of speaking," he answered cryptically. Hermione laughed, resting her hand on her cheeks, warmed from the wine. Pansy blinked at him incredulously. in a manner of, haven't I suffered enough of... Good evening. Percy's polite yet posh baritone floated from the doorway before he approached the table with Ron. Everyone turned to look. That was the sort of presence Percy had developed over the years. He'd always been different, but over time he'd grown out of his desperate need to prove he was better than his family and their circumstances. He'd become a man who knew exactly who he was, where he'd come from, and what he was worth. Percy, who was the head of the International Magical Office of Law, walked with a sort of pride that reflected all he'd learned and experienced. Hermione couldn't help but notice that the two brothers, in addition to being contraries of personality, were also visual opposites. Ron had made an effort tonight with his dark jeans, a white shirt, and brushed hair. Taller than all of his siblings except George, he moved with a swagger of self-assurance, like someone who was settled without a care in the world. Percy, on the other hand, possessed the ease of a seasoned diplomat. Tonight, he looked almost casual in gray tailored trousers, a matching waistcoat, and a white and purple checkered shirt, no bow tie. Hermione had never seen Pansy look so confused. "You're a Weasley?" "I am." Percy looked taken aback by her brashness, but he recovered smoothly. "And you are—" He allowed the question to linger, but when Pansy didn't respond, as she was too busy blinking at him like her brain had short-circuited, Hermione helped her out. "This is Pansy." Percy's blue eyes briefly cut over to Hermione before returning to the black-haired witch. "Ah." He took another step towards her, courteously extending his hand. "And your surname?" Finally she remembered herself, but didn't move to accept his offered hand. In fact, she looked at it, then back up at him. "I'm between surnames right now." Harry almost choked on his drink. Ron, who had returned to his seat during the introduction, slapped him on the back. Percy suppressed a smirk of his own, but didn't retract his hand, maintained eye contact with an almost determined look on his face. For a moment, Hermione thought she'd have to intervene, but only a few more seconds passed before she extended hers as well. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Percy said. Ron glared at his brother. "Oi! I thought you were just coming to say hello to Harry and Hermione." "I've changed my mind," he said to Ron, while still staring at Pansy, whose cheeks had taken on a slight color under his fixed gaze. She cleared her throat as she slowly pulled her hand free of his. Hermione didn't miss the way she flexed her fingers before closing it back into a fist and tucking her arm behind her back. Pansy's eyes cut to her, then flickered around the room as if she were searching for something important. Probably the portal back to the universe where everything made sense to her. She almost laughed at the thought. "If you don't mind the intrusion," Percy glanced at Hermione, "I think I'll stay." "Of course not. Pansy here was just leaving." Percy glanced back at her. "Oh, you are?" "To get more wine, of course." Pansy cleared her throat. She did just that before Hermione could remind her of the half-full bottle right there on the table. Percy took the empty chair next to hers, smoothing invisible wrinkles from his trousers. She glanced over at Harry, who was watching the man with the raised eyebrow that peeked over the thick rim of his glasses. Ron started talking about the seats for the game while Hermione followed her best friend's line of sight back to Percy, who was now making sure his already perfect red hair was just right. Hermione tipped back the rest of her wine. "How was your day, Percy?" Percy completely bypassed the question. "I didn't offend her, did I?" "Why does it matter?" Ron looked confused. "It's just Pansy bleeding—" "Shut up, Ron," Harry and Hermione said simultaneously. The answer to his question was no, but it was also very precarious. However, it wasn't her place to tell him any of that. Being burned and ostracized from society had turned Pansy into a cautious person, a planner who liked to know what was coming so she could adequately prepare herself. She was excellent at reading people, the sort of witch who was jaded or arrogant enough to believe herself immune to being surprised by anyone or anything. The last time she had seen Pansy surprised by a person's actions had been when Hermione hugged her while she cried therapeutic tears over her first finished project. Pansy thought she'd had it, and everyone figured out, but was just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Hermione never had the heart to tell her the truth. The game of life didn't have a standard set of rules. Humans were more complicated than whatever system she had used to sort them all. One day she would meet someone she couldn't immediately categorize. And judging by the way she'd bolted, that day was today, and that person was Percy Weasley. Percy was the only one that stood when Pansy returned with a single wine glass in her hand. She offered no excuses as to why she hadn't grabbed another bottle either. In truth, she looked far more composed until he pulled out her chair. She stared at him. He held her gaze. The standoff lasted until Ron abruptly stopped talking about the game and glared at them both. "Oh, for fuck's sake, just sit down, will you?" They both glared at him, but he didn't even care. Percy thinks of himself as a perfect gentleman. Bit of a tosser, really. Ron only half meant it based on the smirk on his face. Pansy's frown deepened into distaste, and her eyes narrowed into tiny slits, but she placed her wineglass on the table and sat down without further argument. Percy adjusted her chair and returned to his before reaching for an empty glass and the bottle on the table, chilled with magic. He poured himself a perfectly proper amount, then turned to Pansy. "Would you care for more wine?" She was hesitant, still puzzled by his entire existence, when she said, "Yes, please." Percy smiled. The two most powerful warriors are patience and time. Leo Tolstoy.